Picture this. A president steps into the heart of darkness, a mine where children toil in shadows, their dreams buried under dirt. In just 18 minutes, he turns their world upside down, lifting every child's gaze from the ground to the sky. This is a fairy tale. It's a true story of courage, justice, and a leader who refused to look away. From Burkina Faso's mines to a nation transformed, this is the moment that changed everything. Ready to hear how it happened? What we're about to tell you sounds impossible. A president walks into a mine where children are forced to work in darkness, and 18 minutes later, every single child is looking up at the sky instead of down at the dirt. But this isn't just about one moment. It's about how a single act of courage can shatter decades of injustice and transform an entire nation. The story you're about to hear happened in Burkina Faso, and will make you question everything you thought you knew about leadership, justice, and what's truly possible when someone refuses to look the other way. Traoré walked into the mine, and the children's eyes were staring at the ground. 18 minutes later, every single one of them was looking at the sky. That was the line that echoed across newsrooms around the world the next day. Journalists scrambled to understand what had happened in that remote manganese mine in northern Burkina Faso. International news networks picked up the story, but they missed the deeper truth. The real story had started hours before that moment, and it would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. The truth is, what happened that day wasn't just about one president making a bold decision. It was about the culmination of decades of systemic exploitation. Finally meeting someone who refused to accept that children should pay the price for corporate greed and political corruption. The sun was still climbing over the horizon when President Ibrahim Traoré ordered his convoy to halt. They were deep in the heart of the Tamba region, hundreds of miles north of the capital, where the landscape stretched endlessly in shades of red earth and thorny acacia trees. This was mining country, where the manganese deposits had been discovered decades ago and promptly swallowed by foreign corporations working hand in hand with corrupted officials who saw natural resources as personal piggy banks rather than national treasures. But Traoré didn't come here as a politician that morning. He didn't come with a prepared speech or a media strategy. The cameras weren't rolling yet, and there were no reporters trailing behind his armored vehicles. He came as something much more dangerous to the established order. He came as a father who had heard whispers of something so horrific that it demanded immediate action. The intelligence reports had been landing on his desk for weeks. Child labor in the mines, systematic exploitation, corporate executives turning blind eyes, while subcontractors used children as young as 8 to extract valuable minerals from dangerous underground tunnels. But reports are just paper, and paper can be ignored, filed away, forgotten. Traoré needed to see it with his own eyes. The dirt was red beneath their feet, the kind of deep, iron-rich red that stains everything it touches. The air was bone-dry, and the silence that greeted them as they approached the mining compound was the kind of silence that tells you something is terribly, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a remote location. It was the oppressive silence of secrets being kept, of voices being systematically silenced. Traoré stepped down from his armored vehicle alone. His security detail wanted to sweep the area first, to establish perimeters and check for threats. But the only threat here was time. Every minute they delayed was another minute that children spent in darkness, their small hands bleeding as they chipped away at rock faces for minerals that would eventually end up in smartphones and electric car batteries halfway around the world. The sharp crunch of gravel beneath his boots was the only sound as he walked toward the mine entrance. No cameras captured this moment. No speeches were prepared. There was only the weight of moral responsibility and the knowledge that sometimes leadership means walking into darkness, literally, to drag injustice into the light. A miner approached, tall, sunburned, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working under the African sun. His eyes showed recognition mixed with panic. "Mr. President, we weren't expecting," he began, his voice trailing off as he realized that unexpected presidential visits to remote mining operations rarely brought good news for anyone involved. But Traoré raised his hand, cutting off the man's nervous explanations. His voice was calm, steady, but carried an undertone that suggested this was not a request. "Take me to them." The miner hesitated. In that hesitation, Traoré saw everything he needed to know: guilt, Fear, the desperate calculation of someone trying to figure out how much trouble he was in and whether there was any way to minimize the damage. Traoré stared at the man, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to repeat himself. In that stare was the full weight of presidential authority, but more importantly, it carried the moral weight of someone who would not be deterred, delayed, or deceived. Moments later, they were walking toward the tunnel entrance. The mining operation was larger than Traoré had expected, a complex web of tunnels and extraction points that stretched deep into the earth. The legitimate operation employed hundreds of adult workers. But intelligence reports suggested that the most dangerous work, the deepest tunnels, the most unstable areas, was being done by the smallest hands. As they descended into the tunnel system, the temperature dropped noticeably. But this wasn't the refreshing coolness of shade on a hot day. This was the kind of cold that seems to seep into your soul. The cold of places where terrible things happen in darkness, where human dignity goes to die, where children lose their childhoods one day at a time. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with dust and the metallic smell of mineral extraction. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows that danced on the tunnel walls, creating an almost hellish landscape that no child should ever have to navigate. And then he saw them, tiny silhouettes bent over with pickaxes that seemed too heavy for their small frames. Hands that should have been holding pencils or toys were instead blistered and calloused from constant contact with rough stone and metal tools. Backs that should have been straight with youthful confidence were instead arched with the premature wear of hard labor. Eyes that should have been bright with curiosity and wonder were vacant, staring at the ground with the defeated expression of those who had learned that looking up only led to disappointment. They were children, not teenagers who might arguably be old enough for some forms of work, but actual children, some who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Boys and girls who should have been in classrooms learning to read and write, playing with friends, dreaming about their futures. Instead, they were here in this underground nightmare, their small bodies being used to extract wealth that they would never see, their childhoods being sacrificed on the altar of corporate profit margins. The sight hit Traoré like a physical blow. He had seen poverty before. Growing up in Burkina Faso, poverty was never far away. He had seen injustice in various forms throughout his political career. But there was something about seeing children, actual children, being systematically exploited in conditions that would be considered inhumane for adult prisoners, that ignited something deep inside him. One boy, who couldn't have been older than 10, caught his attention. The child wore a piece of blue string around his wrist, the kind of simple bracelet that children make for each other or that parents tie on their children's wrists as a sign of love and protection. In this hellish environment, that small piece of blue string seemed almost defiant, a tiny reminder of innocence in a place designed to destroy it. When Traoré stepped closer, the boy flinched instinctively. The reaction spoke volumes about what these children had learned to expect from adult authority figures. They had been conditioned to fear, to submit, to make themselves as small and invisible as possible to avoid punishment or additional work. "Don't be afraid," Traoré said gently, his voice softer than it had been when speaking to the adult workers. But the boy didn't respond with words. Instead, he pointed behind him with a small, dirt-stained finger toward a wooden box that sat in an alcove carved into the tunnel wall. Inside the box were the remnants of a childhood that had been interrupted. Pieces of bread saved from meals, a torn book with pages missing, and, most heartbreaking of all, a drawing. It was a kind of drawing that any child might make. Simple, honest, full of hope. It showed a house with smoke coming from the chimney, trees with green leaves, and what was unmistakably a school building with children playing outside. "Is this your home?" Traoré asked, pointing to the drawing. The boy didn't answer with words, but something changed in his expression. For the first time since Traoré had entered the tunnel, the child's eyes lifted from the ground. Not all the way up, not yet, but no longer staring at the dirt beneath his feet. That was when Traoré knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level. In that moment, the president of Burkina Faso made himself small so that a child could feel big. It was a gesture that would later be described by witnesses as the moment when everything began to change, not just for that one boy, but for hundreds of children trapped in similar situations across the country. The boys' eyes, when they finally met Traoré, held a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hope. How long had it been since an adult had looked at him with kindness instead of calculation? How long since someone had asked about his dreams instead of demanding his labor? But even as Traoré was connecting with the children underground, the machinery of exploitation was operating above ground. The foreign contractor responsible for this particular mining operation stood outside in the blazing sun, dressed in an expensive linen suit that probably cost more than most of the miners made in a year. He was fanning himself with a folder of documents, looking annoyed at the disruption to his schedule, rather than concerned about what the president might be discovering in the tunnels below. When Traoré emerged from the mine, his clothes covered in dust and his face grim with purpose, the contractor approached with the confident swagger of someone who had been buying his way out of trouble for years. "Mr. President," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "this is quite a surprise. If I had known you were planning to visit, we could have arranged a proper tour, shown you our legitimate operations, the jobs we're creating." But Traoré cut him off with a simple statement. "The children." The contractor's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but now it looked more like a grimace. "Ah, yes. Well, you see, they're not really my responsibility. We have subcontractors who handle certain aspects of the operation, and if there have been any irregularities, you're operating on Burkina Faso soil." Traoré's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the calm exterior. Smug, evasive tone for the contractor, followed by Traoré's calm authority. Of course," the contractor replied, his confidence returning as he fell back on what had probably been a successful defense strategy in the past. "But you have to understand, these subcontractors, they operate independently. They were brought in by local partners. Really, it's quite out of my hands. I'm just here to oversee the technical aspects of mineral extraction." The man's smirk suggested that he had used variations of this explanation many times before, proud other officials who had been satisfied with plausible deniability and a suitable financial consideration to look the other way. But Traoré said nothing in response. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was a kind of photo that gets taken at official functions and galas, the kind where business leaders and government officials shake hands over champagne, while photographers capture moments that later prove very inconvenient. The photograph showed the same contractor, looking younger and more confident, shaking hands with one of Burkina Faso's military generals over what was clearly a contract signing ceremony. Both men were smiling broadly, surrounded by other officials and business leaders, all of them looking very pleased with whatever deal they had just concluded. "This is from last year's mining industry gala," Traoré said, his voice still calm. "You remember this day?" The contractor's face changed completely. The confident smirk disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. That was just a ceremonial signing, you understand? Standard protocol for international partnerships." "I remember it too," Traoré added quietly. "I remember because I was there. I remember the speeches about partnership and development. I remember the promises about creating jobs for adults, about contributing to national development, about operating with full transparency and respect for local laws." The contractor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. In that photograph was evidence of direct engagement with government officials, proof that this wasn't some rogue subcontractor operated without oversight, but part of a systematic arrangement that went to the highest levels. "I think," Traoré continued, "that we need to have a more comprehensive conversation about responsibility and about what happens when international partners fail to honor their commitments to the people of Burkina Faso." As the sun began to set that day, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the iron-rich soil beneath their feet, Traoré made a decision that will reverberate far beyond that remote mining camp. He didn't return to the capital to convene committees or hold meetings or draft policy papers. Instead, he made a phone call. Within hours, 3 buses were making their way along the dusty roads toward the Tamba region. Behind them came trucks, not military vehicles, but civilian trucks loaded with desks, books, uniforms, and all the materials needed to set up temporary classrooms. It was a kind of logistical operation that typically takes weeks of planning, but sometimes moral urgency creates its own efficiency. That evening, Traoré returned to the mine. This time, he wasn't alone. Teachers, social workers, and education officials had made the journey with him. But he still went into the tunnels himself, still knelt down to speak to the children at their own level. "This is your last shift," he told them, his voice carrying a certainty that brooked no argument. "Tomorrow you go to school." The older children looked confused. After months or years of being told that their only value was in their ability to extract minerals from underground tunnels, the concept of education seemed almost foreign. The younger ones looked scared. Change, even positive change, can be terrifying when you've learned to expect only disappointment from adults. But then, in a moment that would later be recounted in classrooms across Burkina Faso, one girl raised her small hand. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, but her voice carried the weight of experience far beyond her years. "My papa says I have to work," she said quietly. "He says that school is a lie, that education doesn't put food on the table, that people like us don't get to dream." Truey smiled, not the political smile of photo opportunities, but the genuine smile of someone who recognized courage when he saw it. Here was a child who had found the strength to voice the fears and doubts that all of them probably shared. "Your papa loves you," Truey replied. "He wants to protect you, to make sure you survive. But surviving and living are different things. Let him come to me. I will explain it to him myself. I will show him that education isn't a luxury for other people's children. It's the right of every child in Burkina Faso." The next morning transformed everything. As the sun rose over the acacia trees, children who had spent months or years in underground darkness sat under a large mango tree, wearing crisp new school uniforms and holding pencils in hands that had grown accustomed to pickaxes. They held those pencils carefully, almost reverently, as if they were sacred objects, which, in a way, they were. The teacher who had volunteered to come to this remote location broke down in tears as she took attendance. For many of these children, this was the first classroom of their lives. Names that had never been written on official documents were now being recorded in attendance books. Children who had been invisible to the system were suddenly becoming visible as students, as individuals, with futures that extended beyond their usefulness in extracting minerals from the earth. But the story was far from over. In the capital, the foreign contractor who had tried to claim ignorance was summoned to testify before a special tribunal. This wasn't a closed-door meeting or a private negotiation. It was a public hearing, broadcast live on national television and radio, with cameras rolling and reporters taking notes. The courtroom was packed with citizens who had heard about the children in the mines and wanted to see justice served. International media representatives were also present, having finally caught up to a story that was beginning to capture global attention. Truey sat silently as the contractor was questioned. The man's expensive lawyers had prepared elaborate defenses, complex legal arguments about jurisdiction and responsibility, contractual limitations, and subcontractor independence. "We didn't know they were children," the contractor insisted, his voice carrying less conviction than it had in previous private conversations. Truey's response was simple and devastating. "Then you are blind. You outsource those operations to local partners? Then you are irresponsible. You were told they were of age without proper documentation? Then you are a liar." Each response cut through the legal complexity and got to the moral heart of the matter. There were no elaborate legal precedents needed here. No complex constitutional interpretations required. The situation was simple. Children had been exploited, adults had profited, and now there had to be consequences. Finally, as the hearing continued and the evidence mounted, the contractor's lead attorney leaned over and whispered something in his client's ear. The contractor nodded, straightened his tie, and looked directly at Truey with what he probably thought was a winning smile. "Look, Mr. President," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a reasonable business proposal. "We can settle this quietly. Compensation for the families, some contribution to local development projects, maybe some scholarships for deserving students. We're reasonable people, and I'm sure we can find a mutually beneficial solution that doesn't need to drag through the courts for years." That's when Truey stood up. The entire courtroom fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried to every corner of the room. "No, we settle this publicly. The people of Burkina Faso, deserve to see what justice looks like. They deserve to know that their children are not for sale, that their natural resources will not be extracted through the exploitation of their most vulnerable citizens, and that there are consequences for those who treat human beings as disposable tools for profit. The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. International observers noted that it wasn't just polite clapping. It was a kind of sustained, emotional applause that comes from people who have waited years to see their values reflected in their leadership. Over the next month, the operation expanded far beyond that single mine in the Tamba region. Investigations revealed a network of exploitation that stretched across multiple mining operations, involving not just foreign corporations, but also local officials who had been complicit in the systematic abuse of child labor laws. 1,400 children were removed from forced labor situations across the country. Each removal was documented. Each child was provided with immediate medical care and psychological support. And each family was connected with social services to address the economic desperation that had forced them to send their children into dangerous work situations. But Traoré understood that rescue without alternatives would just lead to different forms of exploitation. Using revenue seized from the mining corporation's frozen assets, community schools were built in regions where educational infrastructure had been neglected for decades. These weren't just temporary facilities. They were permanent investments in communities that had been overlooked by previous administrations. A new public fund was established, the Children's Dignity Program, funded through a combination of seized assets, redirected mining revenues, and international donations that poured in as the story gained global attention. The program provided not just education, but also school meals, healthcare, and economic support for families transitioning away from child labor. International development experts initially criticized the program as unsustainable, arguing that the emotional response to the mining situation wouldn't translate into long-term funding for education programs. But they underestimated the power of moral clarity and the efficiency that comes from having a clear mission. Every child in Burkina Faso would have the opportunity to look up at the sky instead of down at the ground. Traoré consistently refused to take personal credit for the transformation. In interviews with international media, he redirected attention to the teachers working in remote communities, the families who had made difficult economic sacrifices to prioritize their children's education, and, most importantly, to the children themselves who had shown incredible resilience in transitioning from underground labor to classroom learning. But one day, several months after that first visit to the mine, a letter arrived at the presidential palace. It was written in the careful handwriting of someone still learning to form letters properly, on paper that showed the slight smudges and eraser marks of a student working hard to get every word right. Dear President, it read, "My name is Amadou, and I was in the mine when you came to see us. I was the boy with the blue string on my wrist. I want you to know that now I look at the sky every day, not just because I am not underground anymore, but because my teacher says that education means I can reach for anything I can see up there. I am learning to read better, and I can write my own name now. And someday, I want to be a teacher, too, so I can help other children learn to look up. Thank you for seeing us when we were invisible." In the envelope of the letter was another drawing, but this one was different from the crude sketch that had been hidden in a wooden box in a mining tunnel. This drawing showed the same elements: a house, trees, and a school, but it was rendered with more skill, more confidence, more hope. The school in this drawing was full of children, and above it all was a bright sun and a sky full of possibilities. The international press predictably tried to complicate the narrative. Opinion pieces appeared in major newspapers and magazines, analyzing Traoré's radical intervention and questioning the sustainability of such populist stunts. Editorial boards debated whether the international community should be concerned about a leader who was willing to challenge multinational corporate interests so directly. Some articles dismissed him as an unrealistic dreamer who didn't understand the complexities of international business and global supply chains. Others worried about the precedent being set. What would happen if other African leaders started demanding that international corporations actually follow local laws and respect human rights? But none of that mattered to the people who saw the results every day. In the streets of Burkina Faso, parents began telling their children something they had never been able to say before with confidence. You will study. You will learn. You will have choices because your president fought for that right, and now we will fight to make sure you use it. The cultural shift was perhaps even more significant than the policy changes. In a society where economic desperation had normalized child labor, where families had been forced to choose between immediate survival and their children's futures, there was now a different conversation happening in homes across the country. One afternoon, several months after the initial intervention, Truy was walking past a schoolyard in the capital when he heard a child shout to another student who had dropped some papers, "Pick that up! Keep your school things neat. You're going to be a president one day." He stopped walking and smiled, not for any cameras or photographers, but just because in that moment he could see the future they were building. A future where children believed they could become anything, where education was seen as a pathway to leadership rather than a luxury for other people's children. Because that was the point all along. The mining intervention, the schools, the legal proceedings, all of it was really about changing what was possible in the minds of children who had been taught that their possibilities were limited to what they could extract from the ground. Justice, as it turned out, wasn't always delivered in courtrooms with gavels and formal pronouncements. Sometimes it was delivered under a mango tree with a pencil, a desk, and the revolutionary idea that every child deserves a chance to look up at the sky and dream about reaching it. The boy with the blue string around his wrist became a symbol, but he wasn't unique. Across Burkina Faso, hundreds of children who had learned to keep their eyes on the ground were now lifting their heads, learning to read, discovering that their voices mattered, and beginning to believe that their futures could be different from their past. But the ripple effects of that 18-minute encounter went far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. International labor organizations began investigating similar situations in neighboring countries. The story inspired legislation in the European Parliament, requiring stricter supply chain accountability for companies importing minerals from Africa. Children's rights activists in dozens of countries pointed to the Burkina Faso intervention as proof that decisive action was possible when leaders chose moral courage over political convenience. The mining company executives who had initially dismissed Truy as a populist troublemaker found themselves facing congressional hearings in their home countries. Shareholders began asking uncomfortable questions about the source of their profits. Stock prices fluctuated as investors grappled with the realization that sustainable profits couldn't be built on unsustainable human costs. 6 months after the initial intervention, the first group of children rescued from the mines graduated from their accelerated literacy program. The ceremony was held not in a government building or formal auditorium, but under the same mango tree where they had first held pencils in their small hands. Amadou, the boy with the blue string, stood to address the gathering. His voice was stronger now, more confident, but he still wore that piece of blue string around his wrist, a reminder of where it had come from and how far he had traveled. "When I was in the dark," he said, reading from notes he had written himself, "I thought the world was only as big as the tunnel I was in. I thought the sky was just a story that other people told. But President Truy showed us that the world is bigger than we knew, and that we are bigger than we thought we were." The audience, parents, teachers, government officials, and international observers, listened in silence as a child who had been invisible just months before articulated truths that seasoned politicians struggled to express. "Now I know," Amadou continued, "that every child deserves to see the sky, and someday I will make sure that no child has to look down when they should be looking up." As the ceremony concluded and families celebrated with traditional music and dancing, Truy stood apart from the festivities, watching quietly. An international journalist approached him, camera crew in tow, ready to ask the predictable questions about policy implications and political calculations. But before the reporter could speak, a small hand tugged at Truy's sleeve. It was a girl from the first group of rescued children. Not one of the speakers or ceremony participants, just a child with something to say. "President," she whispered, looking up at her with eyes that now held confidence instead of fear, "my little sister starts school next week. She never had to go in the tunnels because you came when you did. She gets to look at the sky from the very beginning." "What's her name?" he asked. "Hope," the girl replied with a smile. "We named her Hope." And in that moment, as traditional drums played in the background and children who had once been invisible danced under the same sky they had learned to see, the true measure of 18 minutes became clear. It wasn't just about the children who had been rescued. It was about the children who would never need rescuing, the families who would never face that impossible choice between survival and dignity, the communities that would never again have to sacrifice their most precious resources, their children, for someone else's profit. The story that had begun in darkness, in the depths of a manganese mine where children's dreams went to die, had become something else entirely. A story of light, of possibility, of what happens when someone with power chooses to use it, not for personal gain or political advantage, but for the simple, revolutionary idea that every child deserves a chance to look up at the sky and believe that they can reach it. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some families, desperate from generations of poverty, initially resisted the change. They had been promised compensation for their children's work, and the immediate loss of that income created real hardship. Traoré understood this wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing an entire economic ecosystem that had trapped families in cycles of exploitation. That's when the second phase of the Children's Dignity Program launched. Adult family members were offered paid positions in the new educational infrastructure as teaching assistants, school maintenance workers, meal preparers, and community liaisons. Former child laborers' parents became the backbone of the educational system that was replacing the exploitation system. Fatu, whose 8-year-old son had been working in the copper extraction tunnels, became a school cook. "I used to send my child into darkness so we could eat," she said during a community meeting 6 months after the intervention. "Now I feed other people's children so they can stay in the light. It's not just a job, it's redemption." The psychological transformation was as important as the economic one. Child psychologists who worked with the rescued children reported that many initially experienced what they called sky anxiety. After months or years of living in confined spaces, the open sky felt overwhelming, even frightening. Specialized therapy programs helped children adjust to environments where they could see horizons, where their world wasn't limited by tunnel walls. Dr. Aminata Saudu, who led the psychological support team, documented remarkable changes. "These children didn't just need to learn reading and writing," she explained. "They needed to learn how to dream again. Some have forgotten that dreaming was even possible." The international business community's response evolved over time. Initial resistance gave way to what corporate leaders began calling the Burkina Faso Standard, a new benchmark for ethical mining operations. Companies that had initially fought the changes began marketing their child labor-free certification as a competitive advantage. But not everyone was pleased with the transformation. Anonymous threats began arriving at the presidential palace. International mining lobbyists pressured other African leaders to distance themselves from Traoré's radical approach. Some neighboring countries faced economic pressure to ensure they didn't follow Burkina Faso's example. One night, 3 months after the initial intervention, Traoré received a phone call that chilled him to the bone. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear. "Your little school project is costing important people a lot of money. Children have accidents. Presidents have accidents, too." But instead of backing down, Traoré made another decision that surprised everyone. The next morning, he announced that he would personally visit every mining operation in the country. Not with advance notice, not with prepared tours, but unannounced inspections where he would go directly into the work areas to verify compliance with child labor laws. "They want to threaten the children," he said in a televised address. "They want to threaten me, but they cannot threaten the future we are building. Every mine, every operation, every corner of this country where children's rights might be violated, I will be there." The announcement sent shockwaves through the international mining community. Stock prices of companies with operations in Burkina Faso plummeted as investors realized that their profit margins were about to face unprecedented scrutiny. More importantly, the announcement galvanized public support in ways that surprised even Traoré's closest advisors. Spontaneous rallies began appearing in towns across the country. Parents who had never been politically active before began organizing community watch groups to monitor potential child labor violations. Teachers volunteered for remote assignments in mining regions. The most powerful moment came when Amadou, the boy with the blue string, appeared on national television during a live interview with Traoré. Now confident in his reading skills, He read a letter that children from across the country had written collaboratively. Dear President Traoré, Amadou read, his voice steady and clear. We heard that bad people want to hurt you because you saved us. We want you to know that we are not afraid anymore. You taught us to look at the sky, and now we see everything. We see the future, and we will help you protect it. Every child you saved is now a guardian of every child who still needs saving. The letter continued. You walked into darkness to find us. Now we walk in light to find others. The mine owners think they can scare us back underground, but they don't understand. Once you've seen the sky, you can never forget it exists. International news coverage of the child's televised appearance went viral on social media platforms worldwide. Once you've seen the sky became a global hashtag, with children from dozens of countries sharing their own stories of overcoming difficult circumstances. The ripple effects continued to spread. Universities in Europe and North America began developing new curricula around ethical supply chain management, using the Burkina Faso case as a foundational study. Business schools started requiring courses on corporate social responsibility that specifically examined the long-term costs of exploitative labor practices. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was generational. The children who had been rescued from the mines didn't just become students. They became advocates. As they grew older and their education progressed, many chose career paths focused on child protection, education, and social justice. Amadou, 5 years after that first encounter in the tunnel, was accepted into a prestigious international high school program. In his application essay, he wrote, I want to study international law so that no child anywhere in the world has to choose between survival and dignity. My president showed me that 18 minutes of courage can change everything. I want to spend my lifetime turning those 18 minutes into 18 decades protection for children everywhere. The blue string around his wrist had been replaced by a scholarship bracelet, but he kept the original string in a small box with his most treasured possessions, a reminder where it come from and a symbol of how far it was possible to travel when someone believes in your potential. Years later, when historians would analyze this period in Burkina Faso's development, they would point to economic indicators and policy changes, to international partnerships and educational statistics. But the people who lived through it would remember something simpler and more profound. The day their president walked into darkness and brought their children into the light. And in classrooms across the country, where children who had once held pickaxes now held pencils, where voices that had once been silenced now recited lessons and asked questions and dreamed out loud, the lesson was clear. Justice isn't always delivered in courtrooms with gavels and formal pronouncements. Sometimes it's delivered under a tree with a pencil, a desk, and the hope to look up. The children's eyes that had been staring at the ground were now looking at the sky. And that made all the difference. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about justice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.